Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final program of the 2022 10th Annual Film and Discussion Series. For those of you who've been with us all year, and for those of you who have been with us in the past, you know that the series is sponsored by three organizations in the town of Woodstock. Woodstock Transition, which is part of the Global Transition Town Movement. The Woodstock Land Conservancy, which is committed to the protection and preservation of natural and historic sites in the Woodstock area. And finally, the Woodstock Jewish Congregation, which is dedicated to the advancement of Jewish culture, religion, and sustainability practices. We recommend that you click on the speaker view if you haven't done it already, so you can, the image will appear on the whole screen. I'm going to make a short talk about donations. No one who prepares these programs is paid, but there are little things like pencils, papers, paper clips, Scotch tape, all the little things that you need to put a program on. So if you go into the chat, Ellie Reese will put on the chat where you can send your donation. And of course, that's all of what you can do is welcome for us. So my name is Eric Worthman. I'm a member of Woodstock Transition, and I'm going to introduce tonight's program. Around the year 2008, a revolt about the teaching of economics started among students in the academic world and expanded into more than 30 countries. Students began to protest that there was a gap between the theory of economics they were being taught that didn't take into account the increasing global inequality and the nightmare reality of climate change that was happening in the, quote, real world. Approximately 9 years later, addressing these issues of discontent, an Oxford-trained English economist named Kate Rayworth published a book entitled Donut Economics that shook up the field of economics by questioning not only the premises by which the field was being taught, but also the practice of economics in understanding how the world political situation was evolving. She questioned whether mainstream economists' insistence that the field be considered a science blinded them to the everyday problems, subsistence and sustainability that human beings faced every day. At the same time, she understood that in coming years, and here I will quote her, economic theory will play a defining role. Economics is the mother tongue of public policy, the language of public life, and the mindset that shapes society. She then went on to write, humanity's journey through the 21st century will be led by the policymakers, entrepreneurs, teachers, journalists, community organizers, activists, and voters who are being educated today. But these citizens, if we go on to the future, these citizens of 2050 are being taught an economic mindset that is rooted in the textbooks of 1950 and in turn is rooted in the theories of 1850. Given the fast-changing nature of the 21st century, this is shaping up to be a disaster. A brief history of Rayworth's career is worth looking at here. She was disillusioned by the field of economics, so she left the university after getting a master's degree and spent 3 years working in Zanzibar. And again, I'm going to quote her. And all of the women who ran micro businesses while raising their children without running water, without electricity, or a school in sight. She then moved on to the United Nations, writing their annual human development reports, and finally fulfilling her long-held ambition to work with Oxfam, the global organization that fights inequality, to end poverty and injustice. After 10 years, she returned to the study of economics. But what she brought with her, and I should say that she was not alone in thinking this, But what she brought with her was that economics never talked about ethics and or values, never talked about the everyday issues that face people in the world, never talked about the limits of the natural world. That was the starting point for the work that resulted in the book, Donut Economics, a book that has since its publication 5 years ago been taken up by political activists and progressive academics all over the world, and has been used as a tool for engagement by citizens, governments. Right now, she is working with the town of Amsterdam to create an economic model for that city. And it's been used by nonprofits and even some businesses. Now, like many economists and climate change activists, she focuses her critical attention on the idea of continual unfettered growth. This you all know as the famous or the infamous, however you want to look at it, GDP. Instead, she works to create a model where everyone on Earth has access to basic needs, adequate food and education, and the essential goal of protecting our ecosystem. So the plan for this evening is as follows. We will start with the first part of a 45-minute interview with Rayworth that took place at the Disruptive Innovation Festival a few years back. About the 24th minute into her interview, we will stop and, led by Caroline Ritchie, take a longer look at the famous donut drawings that illustrate many of her basic premises. We will then ask members of the audience to write down a brief answer to one of the few questions we will put up on the screen, and to share those answers in a breakout group of 2 or 3 people. Now, this section of the program will take about 15 minutes. Caroline will talk about 8 or 10 minutes about the donut drawings, and the breakout group is only about 5 minutes. We will then resume the film and watch the end of the interview. And at the end of the interview, the final 20 minutes is absolutely terrific. So I really encourage you all to stay with it because Kate is terrific. She's a wonderful speaker. In the remaining time, Kirk Ritchie will lead us in a discussion in which you will appear on the screen. If you want to respond to the film and Kate's ideas, you can raise your hand or raise the hand in the computer, and Kirk will try to call on you. Then we'll come back to me for the last minute, and I will close out the evening in the series for the year. So let's start the video.
Good evening. We're live from Cows in the DIF studio. I'm Jos Blériot. I'm your host today, and I have the pleasure of having with me Kate Rayworth. Kate is the author of Donut Economics, and we're going to be talking about 21st century economics today. So to start us off, Kate, I'd like to quote Thomas Sedlacek, who's a Czech economist who used to be the advisor for President Václav Havel. And he said the first rule about Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. Mm-hmm. The first rule of economics is you do not talk about ethics. What does that bring to mind?
Oh, so I would add a little bit to that. The first rule of 20th century economics is you don't talk about ethics, because last century's economists wanted to prove that economics was a science. So you take away the appearance of values. The first rule of 21st century economics is we start with ethics, because we have to start with what is the economy for. I was never even invited to ask that question in the 4 years that I studied economics, but I think it should be the first question on every syllabus today. If we don't know what the economy is for, we don't know what kind of economy to construct.
So your whole idea of the donut economics, which is really looking at all the parameters and what the economy is actually embedded in, is really saying we're going to look at economics as if there was a world around it, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And how have we come to that notion that actually it's completely removed and it's scientific and neutral and very clinical and happens almost in a test lab kind of environment? What created that, and how could that narrative become so pervasive?
Really key question, actually. I would say it began back in the 1870s when a few highly influential economists like William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras in Switzerland, they wanted to make economics a science as reputable as physics. And they looked to the great physics master of the day, which was Isaac Newton. And they actually literally created analogies between physics and economics. So they said, just as gravity pulls a moving object to rest, so prices pull markets into equilibrium. And the language, it was about market forces, market mechanism, right? You can hear the physics of the day embedded in that language. And it's still there today. So the very first diagram that any economics student learns worldwide, if you ask them, it's always the same, supply and demand. That actually was derived from Jevons attempting to show an economic law of demand, right? We hear people talking about the law of diminishing returns, the laws of supply and demand. There are no laws. This was based on fake physics. And I always say, if you're going to tell students, start with supply and demand, that's like saying the economy is the market and the market's in equilibrium. Well, that's two untruths on day one. It's not a very good place to start your degree. I think today's students deserve something better.
So you're working towards reiterating the falsehood of that claim and starting from another point. But actually, in order to unpack that whole sequence of events, you have to look where the narrative came from.
Yes.
And how it got disseminated to such a scale. I mean, it's quite incredible when you look at the origins of it, because it was just a small group of people almost doing that behind closed doors with a pretty strong agenda. And actually, you've created a series of animations, one of which looks precisely at that. So I suggest we go into that now.
Great.
In April 1947, in a little Swiss village, a small band of economists met with plans to rewrite the global economic story, and they called it neoliberalism. Their method was ingenious. They described each economic actor with a set of such powerful traits that the rest of the script almost wrote itself. In the 1980s, when their laissez-faire story was finally put on the international stage, the plot was loaded from the very start. And so for the last 40 years, we've been told that the market is efficient, so give it free rein. That the state is incompetent, so don't let it meddle. That trade is win-win, so open your borders. That the commons are tragic, so sell them off. That society, well, there's no such thing, so ignore it. And that the household is domestic, so leave it to the women. With such a cast list, the triumph of the market seemed almost inevitable, and it's been driving us into social and ecological crisis. But we were also told that finance is infallible, and that was so clearly disproven in the global financial crash that it's called the rest of the story into question too. It's time to ditch this outdated neoliberal script. We need a new economic story that's fit for the 21st century, one that puts the economy in service to life. So how should that story begin?
Well, it's pretty compelling, and it's surprising at the same time. Because if you look at the smallness of that group and the influence it had, how would you look at it now? Is it because there was no connectivity as we know it, no internet? What was the reason for that strategic take on things?
So it was in the 1940s. It was actually 70 years ago this year, April 1947. A small group of economists met in Montpellier, this little Swiss village, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and they said, we're going to create this neoliberal story. They knew that they would have to seed this story for decades, and they did. It didn't hit the international stage until Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s, but they seeded it in chambers of commerce, in creating posts for professors in university, in setting up think tanks. And so they spread the story. So when Reagan and Thatcher came to power, Reagan was surrounded by Mont Pelerin Society insiders. Margaret Thatcher's first Chancellor of the Exchequer, Geoffrey Howe, was a member of the society. Suddenly the moment came, but it took a long time. We don't have decades to create a new story to replace this broken neoliberal one. But what we do have, I think, is a worldwide web of rethinkers and doers of economics who are already showing how we can put this new story together, exemplifying it in circular economy practices, in distributive design, in new thinking and theory. It's a very exciting task, actually, the 21st century economic movement, to bring together the work of so many people to show that we have this new story. If we can put it together as a synergy and create one new narrative, rather than always leaving it as a critique against the old.
One thing that you say in your book is that economics is the mother tongue of public policy, which effectively says that politics today are the hostage of that old school narrative. So how do we break that cycle? Apart from simply revealing it, I know you're a big fan of Buckminster Fuller, and so are we. So you create a model that renders the other one obsolete. Which is that model, and how do we create it? What tools do we use?
So first, when we listen to today's politicians, they are stuck in this old narrative. And it's almost hardest for politicians to change because they're under this very aggressive media attack that if they say anything that slightly steps away from the accepted paradigm, they can be parodied. They can be made to look ridiculous. So you can tell that politicians know that the old story of unending growth doesn't work. We hear them attempting to reframe what the economy's for. I call it growth bingo. I listen for the words they add. So they'll talk about sustainable growth or inclusive growth, equitable growth, smart growth, balanced growth, good growth, efficient growth. You can have any future you want as long as it's growth. We're stuck. And yet, when people have to add so many adjectives in front of this vision, it's clear that it's ripe for falling. So we need to move away from the growth as a given paradigm and create a new center. And I think we need to come to an era of balance, fundamentally replacing that idea of endless growth, addicted to growth, to an economy that's based on balance. I can express it in very simple terms because we've only just come to understand our deep interdependence with the living world. So I can express what is essential to human well-being in two tiny objects that I happen to have here. One of them is a little bean, right? Every person needs food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, meet your basic human rights to survive day to day. And I would say 20th century economics focused on this so that everybody had the income that they could buy their needs. But that's only half of the story. The other half of the story of human well-being is this little blue marble, planet Earth, which must have a stable climate and fertile soils and a protective ozone layer and abundant biodiversity and thriving ecosystems. It's only 21st century economic thinking that's beginning to put these two together and realize that human well-being lies in a balance between meeting the needs of all, but doing so within the means of the planet. I drew it as a donut diagram, and if we can show it up here on the screen, if it's going to appear, there it is. So we need to get everybody out of this shortfall so that no one is falling short on life's essentials, but each person can meet their needs to water, food, healthcare, income, housing, energy. Everybody gets out of that hole in the middle into the donut itself, but that we don't overshoot our pressure on this extraordinary planet. So it's about a space of balance. Now, where are we today? Well, we are falling short for millions of people worldwide who can't meet their most basic needs, and yet we've already overshot our pressure on the planet's 9 planetary boundaries. So I'd say this is the compass for the 21st century. Our generational challenge, whether as citizens, as politicians, as business leaders, as activists, is to eliminate all the red from that picture, to help ensure that every person can meet their needs, and we come back to do it within the means of the planet.
So what we're saying here, I think, is the overlay, the economic overlay that you're bringing to Johan Rockström's planetary boundary diagram, right?
Yes. So the outside are the 9 planetary boundaries drawn up first by Johan Rockström and colleagues in 2009, revised in 2015 to reflect the latest understanding of the interdependencies of the Earth system. They said we can't overshoot. I've drawn on top of that a social foundation because we also can't have people falling short. And so what was once a circle turns into a donut. That's where the idea of donut economics comes from. This is the donut. And the 21st century compass is shaped like a donut. And our challenge is to get back into that. So we need to find balance. It's not about an ever-rising line of growth. It's about creating balance between meeting human needs, but doing so within the Earth system. It requires more brilliant innovation than we've ever seen before. And that's why it's actually an exciting time to be an economist, if you're part of this story.
And I suppose when it comes to understanding some of these boundaries, the narrative around renewable energy and climate is fairly well established. But it seems that what's missing from the picture is the way the economy deals with materials, natural resources, finite resources. The International Resource Panel is trying to do that, but they still don't have that 2-degree story. Is that something that you're keen to explore as well as part of that new narrative? Finding a way to more holistically look at the way we use, consume, produce all the resources, and not only the energy, and looking at the impacts. And how do you tie that into societal considerations? Because that's the big thing. I mean, the issue is so big that you need to find a clever entry point.
Yeah. So I drew this donut diagram in 2012, and it was published as a discussion paper for Oxfam. I was completely amazed by the international response to it. It just went a bit viral. And I realized the power of pictures, the power of images to shape the fundamental frames that we use in our thinking. You know, our visual intelligence is far greater than we give it credit for. Half the nerve fibers in our brain are linked to our sight. So we should pay real attention to the pictures that we draw and teach and use. So it drove me back to my economics textbooks. And again, the first diagram that every student knows, and probably the last one that they forget, is the crisscross of supply and demand. But if we start economics in a different place, we've got a far greater chance of taking on the questions that you're talking about. So, for example, this is the diagram. I call it the embedded economy diagram. This is the first diagram I'll show any economics student. What you can see is that there's the economy made up of the household, the commons, the market, and the state, 4 forms of provisioning. It's embedded in society, all its social, cultural, political institutions, embedded in the living world, with a river of solar energy flowing right through it. There's the thermodynamics of energy, but also drawing in living matter and materials and spewing out waste and pollution all the time. So the economy is an open system within the Earth system. And if we look at this, we start here from day one, we can ask the question, how big can that through flow of materials and resources be before they begin to disrupt the very Earth system processes on which we depend? So it invites us to think about fossil fuels and filling Earth's sink of the atmosphere, but also about the materials that we use. We cannot have this linear through flow. We need to turn it into a secular or circular economy in which resources are never used up, but always used again and again. The way I like to put it is we need an economy that works with and within the cycles of the living world. So we have to begin that paradigm change on day one. It's not something that you arrive at later down the line. Because if your degree or your economic thinking starts with supply and demand, it's all about the market, this will get dismissed as externalities, right? Oh, these are environmental externalities. I'm sorry, but if someone's talking about the living world in terms of externalities, then you've already told me how important it isn't. It has to be at the heart of our framing from day one.
And what about the societal and society implications? Because society is right here between the Earth and the economy. So how does that work out? What are the impacts of, if you accept that an economy shapes a society, what are we talking about here?
So the economy depends upon society in many different ways, and it reshapes society itself. It depends upon society because to have a market, you have to have all sorts of social institutions. You have to have trust, actually, between people that they will trade with each other. You have to have the legal framework that makes people believe that if I offer credit, I will get repaid. So it's a whole social construct of cooperation in order to allow the competitive nature of markets to exist in the first place. But also the kind of economy we have restructures social institutions. And as you can see in the middle there, I've labeled the economy as having these 4 kinds of provisioning, because in the 20th century, we got completely obsessed with the ideological boxing match between the market and the state, right? It came down to a question, are you a laissez-faire free market capitalist, or are you a state-loving socialist? And in that binary boxing match, we lost sight of two other key provisioning sectors: the household, where we all begin every day, that unpaid caring work of cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising the children who become the labour for the economy, and also caring for our parents and our partners, totally outside the monetised economy, but an absolute subsidy to it, right? The monetary economy utterly depends upon that unpaid caring work. But also the commons, which is a place where people get together, not through the market, not under the state, but as a community, self-organising to create things that they collectively value, whether it's a neighbourhood garden on the corner of your block or Wikipedia on the World Wide Web. Now, mainstream economics ignores the living world here. It ignores the household. It ignores the commons. It's ignoring three of the most fundamental sources of our well-being. We have to start with these in the picture and realise that the wider vision of an economy, which is also the household and the commons, that reshapes our social behaviour and reshapes our interactions. The society is the space in which the economy exists. It's not a separate thing. The economy is one form of our social relations.
Yeah, I'm glad you were coming to that, because I've been given this tablet which feeds a few questions, and apparently I've been given the blunt, non-political correct version of the tablet because it doesn't filter anything. And it says somebody is asking, and I'd like to remind everyone that DIF is interactive, so keep your questions coming. You talk about inequality, environmental destruction, human rights. I can imagine some people might write you off as a left-wing economist. How might you attract the interest of people across political divides? In other words, are you shooting yourself in the foot by revealing your values?
Oh, I think, no, I haven't at all felt like I've shot any bullets in my foot by revealing my values. Because if we don't start from values, then they are just deeply implicit within the system, right? And they're always going to be hidden. I'm passionate to have conversations with people about their values, and if they don't share them, let's talk about it. But actually, as I often say when I show this diagram, we've got the market, the state, the household, and the commons. I wouldn't want to live in an economy that lacked any one of those, because the market is an incredible mechanism for allocating resources between millions, even billions, of individual people who never need to talk or communicate. It's got the price mechanism, as Adam Smith said, is incredible. The trouble with the market is that it only values what's priced, and it only pays attention to things, you know, that have that value on. So it works within a limited sphere. We've got to put that together with recognition of the value of state-produced goods and the household and the commons. You know, the sort of left wing, or, oh, you haven't used the word capitalist, or are you a socialist? I find these words so locked in the 20th century, I don't use them. Because if I say capitalism, somebody else will say socialism, somebody else will say communism. We're in an isms from the last century. I think we have a chance to wipe the slate of all those old words that carry such heavy baggage that doesn't help us. Left wing, right wing. So I would love somebody to say, I disagree with this diagram. Let's just take it on its terms, not with old labels, but what is it you don't agree with here? And then we can get beyond apparent political differences, which actually prevent us from having a more fundamental reframing of the kind of economy we want to create.
And actually, at that point, I'd like to remark that you teach both at Oxford and Cambridge, which can hardly be described as hotbeds of radicalism, unless, and I'm happy to stand corrected if you think otherwise. So,
I also teach at Schumacher College, which is the heart of one of forms of radicalism, and I love it. I teach students at Oxford University, I teach students at Schumacher College. I teach them the same thing. So it's about engaging with people from all different perspectives. I work a lot with major companies. I've spoken at wealth managers conferences. I've also spoken to Occupy movement, because we all need to have these conversations, and we all need to see new pictures if we want to transform our frames and question ourselves about where am I in this picture and how am I helping or not transforming the frame. I mean, if I really want to, I'll go back to this diagram. This is the state of the 21st century economy. Do you disagree that this is our 21st century challenge? And let's talk about values, because if we don't agree on that picture, then we really need to have a bigger conversation before we dive into reimagining the economy.
Let's go back to students, because a couple of years ago there was a big movement of economic students walking out of lectures and saying, you know, you're not teaching us about realities. It's a construct. We don't want to hear about this. We want proper economics that reflect the world that we're living in. Where is that movement? Has it achieved anything? Did it have an impact on the curriculum, on the way things were taught, on the content?
that movement is bigger and better today than it was then. It may have been highly visible because the students were walking out of lectures and it hit the newspaper headlines. They've actually created an international movement. It's called Rethinking Economics. That's one of the leading groups. Internationally, students have realized that the danger for student movements is students turn over every 3 years, professors persist. So there's a real danger that the students just leave. They've now created their own institutions that they have fantastic website. Anybody can go and look at Rethinking Economics and see that they just held the first festival of new economic thinking in Edinburgh just last month. The students are actually at the forefront of new economic thinking. They're demanding pluralism. So they want to be taught all kinds of economic thinking and respected to draw upon their own judgment as to which school of economic thought to bring into their own decision making. So I think actually it's a very, very powerful movement. I mean, the irony is, right, students go to university to get an education. Economic students worldwide have suddenly realized they've signed up for a degree, often paying huge fees and dedicating years of their life. And on day one, they realize that the syllabus they're being taught is stuck in the last century and it's not half fit to equip them for the challenges ahead. So the first job they have as students is to lobby their teachers to teach them something worth learning. It's an extraordinary moment. No other academic discipline has achieved this. So I think the economics students are a really important part of this change. And we need to work together as a movement, whether it's progressive professors who are working with them, the students, the businesses, the politicians, who all see we're desperate for a new economic narrative.
That's really interesting. Now, there's one thing I'd like to point out, and I don't know if I should be intrigued or worried, but you turned up to our conversation with this. But before we go into the why, I'd like to turn to my co-host Marco, who has really important news.
Okay. All right, I'm just going to share my screen with you. My name's Caroline Ritchie. And we are going to take another look at these pictures that are worth 1,000 words, as Kate was just saying. I mean, she really went through them pretty well there. But, you know, if it's your first time hearing it, you might appreciate being able to look again at them. So here's the first one. It's the embedded economy, where, you know, this striking idea that the economy is located on the earth, which is where everything is located, our home. And within the earth, of course, we have human beings living and the society that we create, and the economy is a creation by human beings, by human society. And she's got those 4 elements of it: the household, the state, the commons, and the market. And then this little arrows in the middle showing financial flows that enable the economy to flow between those 4 parts. And of course, the earth itself has most of the energy on the earth comes from the sun, and that flows across, and there's the waste heat that goes out the other side, like a river. And everything that we use in our economy to make things comes from living matter and materials that are on the earth. Goes into the economy and out the other side, back into the earth, because there's no place else for it to go, is the waste matter. So seems kind of basic, but that's where we are. And then this one I think of as the birth of the donut. We had, you know, those environmental constraints were being spoken about in the economics community. And, you know, Kate drew this inner circle of, you know, the social needs. And so the ceiling of, you know, the boundaries of the planet, and then the inner circle of meeting the needs, the basic needs of human beings, created this sweet spot here, which is the donut. And again, as she said, that, you know, just took off as an idea in a way she hadn't really imagined. And then here you have the donuts fleshed out a little bit more. Got some labels on it that you'll see on the following ones again. So obviously the whole thing is contained within the earth. We've got the ecological ceiling of, what the earth can absorb and remain healthy. And if those boundaries are transgressed, we get into some critical planetary degradation. And then this inner circle, which is the social foundation, and people fall off the donut and into the donut hole there in the middle, and that's the realm of critical human deprivation, where those basic needs aren't being met. And then the sweet spot in the donut is what Kate calls the safe and just space for humanity. You'll see that label on a lot of these. That is created by a regenerative and distributive economy by design. Here's the same donut, and I kind of chose this one because you'll see donuts in all different colors, and maybe the labels might be a little different from one to the next, but we can see, in case you're thinking, what are you talking about? Although Kate did say clearly where these came from, but you've got these ecological limits of air pollution, ozone layer depletion, climate change, we all aware of that one, ocean acidification, it's a big issue, chemical pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, fresh water withdrawals, land conversion, and biodiversity loss. I think those are all pretty self-explanatory, as are the ones in the middle, without which human beings cannot thrive, which are water and food and healthcare and education, income and work, peace and justice, a political voice, social equity, gender equality, housing, networks, and energy. Then she's calling this like the compass, where we're going to see on the next slide, if we overshoot those ecological ceiling, we get into that critical environmental degradation. And when human beings fall off into the shortfall in the middle, they get into some deprivation. And so here is a snapshot we were seeing in the video there of the world. And again, you've got the same labels as we had before, but now we've got the red and the gray is quantifying, or it's showing us where we have either overshoots of the environmental ceiling, or we have shortfalls for human beings' basic needs. And I'm going to jump forward. We're going to come back to that one. But there's this really cool website, which we'll send out in the resources, where you can choose 2 countries and you can look at them side to side. And you can see, for example, here's Germany. And you can see these look different than the one for the global snapshot, because every country is, in a different place in terms of where their particular donut snapshot looks like. And so you see here in Germany, for example, they're showing like all of those basic human needs are being met for all of the people. And you've got these, on the other hand, that's great. On the other hand, the ecological ceiling is, overshot in all but 2. Whereas over here in Bangladesh, you see a lot of red in the middle here, where people's basic needs are not fulfilled, and no transgressing the boundary of the ecological ceiling. As a matter of fact, they have room to increase their use of the resources of the natural world. And of course, we're used to thinking of Bangladesh as a developing country, but in this model, there is no country in the world that is not a developing country, because Germany needs to figure out how to meet the needs of all its people within the means of the planet, because that can't go on forever. And Bangladesh needs to figure out the same thing as they move forward. And I'm going to show you this other slide here, which is kind of blurry, but bear with me, just look at it from a distance. I just like this one because it doesn't limit the overshoots to that, circle. And so this is just a pretty cool, graphic of showing you like these 3 different countries. You got Bangladesh again there. So that looks pretty much the same since they weren't shooting outside of it. And Egypt, which, this one looks the same as on either diagram, but here you can see Norway looks pretty different when you have the red of the ecological overshoots going to the outside. And this particular diagram also has the income per capita listed for these 3 different countries. But again, getting back to the global snapshot, which is, of course, all of the different countries averaged out together, where we're looking at the population of the Earth as a whole and the planet as a whole. This is where we are at. So as we mentioned, we're going to break out into breakout rooms in a minute. We're going to give you a couple of minutes to just look at this with some quiet, and to consider these 2 questions that we have here. And it's going to be a very short little breakout. And I know some people are not real keen on talking, so please don't leave. If you don't want to talk, that's okay, because it's just going to be a few minutes, and maybe you'll have a very talkative partner that would love to take all the time, and you can just listen. And then we will come back to watch the last 20 minutes of the video, which gets into some really interesting topics, because what we have now is kind of just laid the foundation of the donut economics framework. And then it's more complex, of course, because it's a monumental task to figure out how to develop ourselves to meet the needs of all humans within the means of the planet.
Kate, what about this?
Well, I never travel anywhere without hose pipes, Joss, come on. So we began by talking about the economists who wanted to make economics a science like Newton, right? They wanted to discover these laws of motion. It turns out there are no economic laws of motion. And the exciting journey for the 21st century economist is to discover the economic laws of the economic designs that we need to put in practice. I think there are 2 design principles we need to put at the heart of the 21st century economist. The first one is to be regenerative by design. And I think that's where my work really closely fits together with the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, because it's about creating a circular or cyclical economy in which resources are used and never used up. But the second one is to be distributive by design, and to ensure that value created is shared far more equitably than it is currently. And for me, the key thing is that these go together. I don't think we can have a regenerative circular economy that is not distributive by design. There's a danger we head towards circular elitism. So I bought my hose pipes to tell this story. So look, here's the linear degenerative 20th century economy, in which we stuff resources into the end, we take those resources, we make them into stuff we want, we use it for a while, we throw it away. This is the cutting against the cycles of the living world. So what does a business that does this needs to do to be part of the circular economy? Close the loop, create a closed loop system. Here you are, you hold that. So there you go, you need to hold it in the middle. There we go. So, we sell you our products, please send them back and we'll refurbish them and sell them again, right? We've got a closed loop economy. Okay, let's say that's one clothing company. And there's another clothing company. Oh, we're making, our clothes as well. We want to be part of the circular economy. So we're going to close our loop. No, hold it. No,
okay.
you have to keep No, you're not finished, mate. So right, there we go. Now we've got the beginnings of the circular economy. Okay? Now imagine if every company in the world was doing this. Say, send us the things back and we'll recycle it. And we had these individual closed loops. You see, it's cute. You look cute, Joss. But
thank you very much.
Nature would never do this. Nature would laugh at us. Okay, pop those down. That is not going to get us to a circular economy. Nature doesn't turn a daffodil into a daffodil or a robin into a robin. Nature does this. Okay. So this, I believe, is the ecosystem approach to a circular economy in which all companies are deeply interconnected in a web of material reuse. I'm really inspired by the work of Janine Benyus, right? And she says nature uses a few basic polymers again and again, like chitin and lignin and keratin. We need to have an ecosystem in which all companies are using the same polymers, whether it's for fabrics or for metals, and that they can be returned to any point in that ecosystem and be reused by all. Then we'll have an ecosystem of resource use, and it will be regenerative. This is a circular economy, but it's also distributive by design. To me, that's the exciting next evolution of the circular economy. And the question is, how do you create the regulation, the policy environment, the tax and incentive environment, the regulation, and the business models that actually make this the future of the circular economy? No more individual little hose pipes.
That calls for a massive degree of alignment and collaboration and agreement on those basic polymers if we want to go to
Yes.
that. But I'm glad you brought up Janine Benyus, biomimicry, because our friend Michael Paulin popped up on my tablet. So he wants to say a lot of things. Actually, there is a question in there, but it's also a big postcard for you. I can show it to the screen. It's actually quite long, so I'm not going to read all of it. Sorry, Michael. Final question is there a way of referring to growth that you would be comfortable with? That's his question to you.
Great question. Thank you for that question, Michael. Oh, yes, absolutely. Look at this. Beautiful. This plant is growing, right? Growth is a wonderful, natural, healthy phase. But the trouble with our economies is that the way growth has been imagined in economics is its shape is this ever-rising line, unending growth, 3% every year, thank you very much, right? That just shoots through the ceiling. Look to nature, which has been thriving for nearly 4 billion years, and it's a pretty good example to learn from, biomimicry. How does nature grow, right? In nature, nothing grows forever. From whether it's your children's feet or the Amazon forest, things grow. It's a wonderful, healthy phase, but then they grow up and they come to mature. And if they mature, they can thrive for a long, long, long time. In my economics degrees, and I know the students today, was never invited to ask that question. What would it look like to create an economy that grew until it had grown up, that meets the needs of all, and then could be an economy that didn't grow but thrived? Because things that try to grow forever, they destroy the host on which they depend. In our own body, we know it. We call it cancer. So why on earth would we expect that we could create economies that would be the one system that would buck that trend? What would it look like to create economies that grow until they thrive? And the way I say it simplest is we have economies that need to grow, whether or not they make us thrive. In fact, it's driving us to extreme inequality and running down the living world. What we need are economies that allow us to thrive, whether or not they grow.
That goes back to Tim Jackson's point about prosperity without growth,
Yes.
which actually was a report to the government. So another question would be, has the government or any of the powers that be actually listened to that message? And if they did, what have they done to act upon that message?
So first of all, I'd say, and I think Tim would agree with me, what we're actually looking for is prosperity with or without growth, because I'm not against GDP growth. What I'm for is a regenerative and distributive economy. And sometimes things need to grow in order to take us there. Just one example would be the government of China has invested $360 billion in installing solar energy capacity by 2020. So that's a huge uptick for GDP growth in China. But once that capacity is in, it's near zero marginal cost of generating electricity, so it doesn't add. So I think GDP has to shift from being this target variable that must always be growing to becoming a response variable that moves up and down in response to the investments and the transformations that are required. So I wouldn't be surprised if GDP actually needs to go up at some point as we make this transformative investment in technologies and energy systems that actually enable us to thrive. So governments, the book I wrote it with a long view for the whole 21st century of this, because it's a long transformation. I was appealing to the student's mind, to the next generation. What's really struck me is that since the book came out, I have been approached by people who I would say are right at the front lines of today's economy, political parties, individual politicians from actually across the spectrum, not just in the UK, but actually across the world, saying, I want to learn more about this, I want to understand this more. How could I talk about this kind of economy? A couple of politicians have begun to use the word thrive instead of grow, because they see it's the beginning of a new paradigm that's still positive. Back to Buckminster Fuller, don't just negate growth. Oh, I'm not for a growth economy. What are you for? You've got to be for something. I'm for an economy that enables us to thrive. But also businesses. Some of the world's biggest household name businesses have approached me and said, what would it look like to transform ourselves so that we could actually be part of a thriving future? And asking pretty fundamental questions about how they're owned, how they're structured, how they're incentivized to become part of that future. So it just strikes me that so many people at the front line of today's economy are incredibly hungry for a new paradigm, because they're coming searching for how can we reimagine and recreate ourselves in a way that actually will be consistent with this new vision.
Well, yeah, which ties into an interesting question that we got on Twitter. Gillian Julius, which is a great name, by the way, is asking, how can we begin to design human activity not simply to respect the living systems and the limits of living system, but actually to contribute to it? So that idea of regenerative, of building natural capital, not just only preserving what we have, but adding to the equation.
So again, I find Janine Benyus's work incredibly inspiring here. She always talks about we need to be generous. How could we, for example, create cities which are going to be the locus of so much human activity this century? How could you create a generous city that actually gives back to the living cycle? So again, we need to understand that we are part of a living system that has natural cycles, and we humans are participants in those cycles. In the past, we have taken and disposed. We've been linear. We need to now become cyclical. So how do we become full participants in regenerating Earth's cycles? And I love the work of Janine Benyus. If she's ever asked to help say, how would the city become regenerative, she'll go to the wild land next door and take its metrics. How much carbon dioxide does this nearby forest sequester? How much soil does it build? How much rainwater does it store? How much biodiversity does it house? What would it look like to set that as the ambition for the city we build? How could a city sequester as much carbon dioxide as its nearby forest? Is it in the building materials? Is it in the trees you plant there? How could it house biodiversity? How could it store groundwater? Again, this is a really exciting time, not only to be an urban architect or urban designer, but what kind of economic institutions will make that make sense? I think today's designers ask this wonderful question of how many benefits can we generate from the way we design this? But when they want to get their ideas put into practice, they still have to go to 20th century finance, which still asks one question: how much financial value can I extract from this? And I think we're seeing an incredible psychological drama between these two mindsets. How many benefits can we build in? Benefits to the community, benefits to the environment, layering in that generative design, versus extractive finance. How much value can I extract? Finance has to be transformed to make it aligned with this 21st century vision.
But we don't account for that. We don't account for the benefits added. It's always, if we mitigate, so that's a cost which is avoided, but how do we start accounting for the plus? All the stuff that is actually regenerative, and say, I've contributed to that. And let's look, even life cycle analysis tools don't account for that.
Yeah. So there are two ways you can go. We want to account for it in the sense of we want to recognize it and understand it and see what we're contributing, the benefits we're generating. One way to go is to say, right, accounting, well, that's a monetary task, isn't it? Because we think of accounts being generated in dollar terms. So let's account for all these things in dollar terms, and we'll put a price on ecosystem services, and we'll value natural capital, and we can add it into the balance sheet. I understand why people do that, and the particularly people who are doing that are at the front line of policy making today. They're trying to get insect-killing pesticides banned. They're trying to protect a wood that's on the edge of being destroyed to build a service station, for example. The danger of that route is that we win the single battle, but we lose the war, because in general what we're doing, the framing we're doing, is saying, it's okay, economists, economics and finance is still the mother tongue of public policy, so we're just going to express the natural world in a language that you know and love. We're going to hand over those numbers to you, and you can do the calculations. There's a real danger there that we remove social protest, we remove moral argument, we remove passion, and we turn it into a financing job, which, as anyone who does accounts knows, you can write accounts for whatever result you want them to bring out. So the other route is to say, let's account for it, but let's account for it in its own terms. And that's why I love the planetary boundaries work. It tells us about our relationship and our pressure on the planet, but not in dollars. It's in parts per million of carbon dioxide. It's in tons of nitrogen fertilizer. So we need to broaden our understanding of the living world and start to use natural and social metrics. So I want to see not one single number that accounts for the value of everything. I think it'll always be flawed, and I worry that the living world will always lose out in that calculation. I think we need to move towards a dashboard expressed in multiple metrics and often drawn visually, which is why the donut is drawn visually. We see the picture. We don't have to know the numbers. We can see it and feel it.
I'd like to go back to the cities thing, because it's interesting to see groups like the C40 or the Global Covenant of Mayors taking responsibility for a lot of things, including CO2. And if you look at the balance of power, which might be shifting from national states or federal states, you see, for instance, that cities in the US or states in the US are stepping up to fill the void left by the federal government when it comes to climate action, for instance. Do you think that this is going to play a major part in shifting from one system to the other? The fact that there are local solutions being unearthed, and to a certain extent, you say global commons is a massive question, and it's so massive that actually nobody does anything about it because it's too big. But if you start to say, this can be fixed at local level, and we're going to streamline the number of problems that have to be dealt with globally, then you start moving. What do you think about that?
So I think geopolitically, in terms of the phase we're at in history, yes, we are seeing the rise of the city mayor, the city ambition in response to the failure of the state to move forward, particularly in the US at this moment. And leadership is wherever leadership emerges, and it's emerging at the level of cities and states. Of course, the US has a system where states can have state law, and so they can bring in place the kinds of regulations needed to actually enable a circular and distributive economy to happen. Other countries don't have that same devolution of regulatory power, so it's harder for individual cities to make the full shift with all the policy and regulatory backing that it needs. But I think a city is a really powerful scale. I mean, Adam Smith himself, for all his excitement about the powers of the market, he believed of course it had to be local, because otherwise externalities, as they're called, would disappear off outside. The impact of our actions need to be witnessed locally so that they can be taken into account in the whole. So I think the city is a really new, powerful locus of transformation. It's one that people also feel proud to be part of. They feel a belonging. And that's really important, going back to the role of society and social behavior change. I feel proud to be part of this city. This is the way we do things here. We bike, we don't drive. We recycle our waste. We are proud to be a zero carbon city, for example. I think that's a really important move forward in the leadership we need.
I'll take another question from the DIF website, and Sally is asking, what makes you think the people who hold the power in the neoliberal economy will relinquish it without a fight?
Nothing makes me think that. Why would they? So instead of bashing on closed doors, I'm a mother of twins, so I've spent the last decade realizing I've got no time to bash on closed doors. My strategy, and the strategy of many people in this movement, is to go where the energy is. Back to Buckminster Fuller, right? You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change things, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So the way to move away from that neoliberal model is to build a compelling, irresistible alternative to show it's already happening, because it is. Circular economy, businesses and initiatives are already in play. Distributive design, the employee ownership of business, community currencies, employee-owned energy systems, fab labs, open source design. This is all springing up, and the beauty is it's not being done by any central government. It's springing up thanks to people everywhere who are saying, you know what, this makes sense to me. I want to be part of this. So my excitement in writing this book on donut economics was exactly to exemplify the new emerging economy. And then you've got the old economy that doesn't want to let go, but you've got the new economy that's growing and people are excited to be part of and proud to be part of. Much more proud to be here, actually, than here. Young graduate recruits actually don't really want to work for the big old companies anymore, and those companies know it. So how can we bring up the new? It's tricky, right? The old is going to cling on, but how do you bring up the new? Part of that strategy is to celebrate it, to sing it, and to show the economic theory that from which it actually makes sense.
Kate, we're coming to the end of our conversation, unfortunately, and I'd like to close by looking at your book. So let's show the book.
There it is.
And I'd really like to encourage everybody to read the book, whether it's a PDF format, whatever. Find the thinking and read about it and think about it. And there is a question by Colin on the DIF website who's asking what are the big criticisms of your book. Presumably you get a lot of fan mail. You probably get a lot of challenging questions as well. And what's the one that really kept you up or thought, maybe I should have addressed that in a different way, if any?
Honestly, I haven't yet had the really big critiques that have made me think, oh, heck, I really missed that one. I'm waiting for them. I actually want the mainstream economists to bring their critiques. I would love to take on one of the big names of mainstream economics. Please read my book and with all sincerity tell me what you see doesn't work in here, what doesn't make sense in here. It hasn't happened yet. I've occasionally gone head to head with so-called mainstream economists, but what they've come back with doesn't work for me. Sometimes they'll say, oh, you're talking about externalities, as if they could embody it, in the old paradigm. So I'm still waiting for that. That's an invitation. But I will say, when I was writing this book, standing in the playground waiting to pick my kids up, and other parents say, what are you doing? I say, I'm writing a book about rethinking economics. The first thing people do is they'd sort of draw back and they'd say, I was never very good at maths at school. I don't think I'd understand that. So I always say, look, the only numbers in my book are the page numbers. We can all understand this because economics, the natural language of economics, I believe is not equations. That was part, maths is useful if you're doing something that likes to be expressed in maths, but it's not the first language of economics. We need to bring it back actually into words and pictures, make it playful and accessible because we're all part of this economy.
Tell you what, when you do find that person who challenges you, before you go into that conversation, can you call us to make sure we record it or we stream it? Because I think it's going to be a very valuable piece of insight.
You're on.
That's it from us. Kate, thank you very much for taking the time to come and for being so open in your answers and your willingness to share that narrative with us. That's it from us.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoy the video. I think I'm being heard, right? Good. All right. Good. So here we are. Still, we just wanted to open up a conversation with people, and I'd like to pose a question to sort of guide the conversation, if you will. And I'd just like to ask everyone, what element of the donut economics that we've just learned about and heard about are you most heartened to see included? Again, what aspect of the donut economics are you most heartened and that you saw that's being included in the model? Anyone? And you can raise your hand like this, and then I will call on you and we'll move through the program. You can also use your reactions if you wish, but does anyone have their hand up? No, not yet. I'm just going through. Anyone? Or maybe I could ask another question. Well, if that is not reaching people, how do you think planning would benefit from the donut framework? Planning in your business, planning in your town, planning in your home. How do you think applying the donut would be applicable for you in your personal life in whatever way you find appropriate? Those are the two things. I'm looking for hands. Anybody? Okay, we have, I'm sorry, I don't see, yes. I don't know why I'm not seeing your name. Your name is not listed in your box, so.
Larry.
Oh, Larry is there, okay. No, it's not Larry, and then there was also this woman, you have your hand up now. So if
And Jude is also raising her hand.
Okay, so first, Larry, then Jude, and then, yeah, go ahead. Please, someone.
Hello there. So what I've been working on over the last, I would say, almost 10 years is the release of refrigerants as a pollutant, a chemical pollutant into the atmosphere by people who are not understanding the parameters of getting rid of their old appliances, leaky air conditioners, supermarkets that leak 25% of their weight of refrigerant every year because of leaks that have not found and fixed, and trying to raise awareness of that in the community and in the Hudson Valley. So I've been working on that for a number of years and making some progress, changing the we've got some pretty good laws going into New York State, whether they'll implement it or not, whether the next technician I see working on an air conditioner is in a cloud of refrigerant oil that he's just blowing off into the atmosphere because it's too expensive to reclaim it.
Hmm.
That's what I've been working on.
Well, thank you, Larry. That's obviously working on sort of the constraints of the environment and trying to fix some of those issues associated with that. Jude, you had your hand up. You have to unmute yourself, Jude. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Jude, and then we'll be all able to hear you.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, it's good. Thank you.
Just a big thank you for airing this. It's such important stuff, and it's something that, being a very non-linear person, naturally, I've resonated with for a long time, and so love Kate's work. And a few years ago, I dropped a box of donuts and a bunch of information about donut economics into Pat Ryan's office in the town in Kingston, hoping that it might inspire something. I can't say that it did. So if anybody else feels inclined to follow up on that and take some donuts to Pat Ryan and some more of these actually this what would be great would be to ensure that he sees this, what you've just done, you guys. Seriously. So who feels proactive enough to go and get this onto his desk somehow? Ellie, Polly, Kirk, anybody?
Yes.
Anyway, so just a big thank you.
Yes, Jude, that's an excellent idea. I love the idea of delivering donuts to someone. Get their attention.
With the information, I mean, with all the stuff, obviously, and the diagrams and everything. Yeah, of course.
That's great. Anyone else that has a comment you'd like to add to the conversation this evening for the remainder of the time we're together?
Ellie Lessing, Kirk.
Okay, Ellie, I see your hand. Thank you. You can unmute yourself and then begin to speak. There you go.
Thanks. I think that you asked how would, bringing her insights into my work, what difference would it make? And I just love it because I love the tweaking of what one would consider being a success, actually having life and well-being being at the center of it, that would be part of success, this concept of thriving and flourishing. It literally, it's a tweak, but it's a wonderful tweak. And I mean, if humanity started thinking that way, instead of, gotta make it, gotta get that thing to rise, quarterly profits, I think it would make for a very different world. So
great. Ellie,
very happy to have been here tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you were here.
Yeah.
Glad you enjoyed it. Thank you, Ellie. Anyone else? Okay, Patty, unmute yourself, please.
Hi.
Hi.
I think one of the things that I most loved about watching this was her insistence that what makes this comprehensible and really appealing are the pictures and the visual of the donut. And I would never go near economics when I was being educated. It was just like, oh God, don't make me do math. And I'm just wondering if it would be a really interesting thing if people would bring this to high school students or even junior high school students and sort of introduce them to economics by teaching them with pictures about the idea that there's this old-fashioned idea of economics, and now there's this completely new transformative idea of economics, and we can learn about it just by looking at these pictures. And at the same time, sort of save the planet, and you won't have to, kind of live in a horribly deteriorated world. So, you know, I think we should sort of beam it into the heads of any educators we know.
Great suggestion. Thank you. Stuart.
I want to build off your comment, Patty, because I firmly believe that we've been strung out on math and strung out on financialization. In fact, we only value that which can be translated into a dollar metric, right? And so the image of and the education is pretty simple, starting at kindergarten, really, first grade. It's just this concept that economics is about management of the household. It's about how we organize ourselves in our community. We bring economics home. And one of the images I've come across that I really like is this concept of a nest, kind of that we are actually held carefully in the nest of life of the planetary ecosystem. And it conveys from a very early age this idea that we absolutely depend on our nest to take care of us, right? So we can really start economics education at the youngest of ages. It doesn't have to wait till high school, because at the end of the day, economics is about our interwoven interdependency with the ecosystem upon which we depend. And any child can learn from nature right away on that front.
Great. Stuart, thank you.
Right.
Lots of people clapping on that one, Stuart. Anyone else would like to raise their hand so we can have you speak for a moment about what you saw this evening that was moved you? Going once, going twice. Anything that, again, that ways in which you could see bringing this donut economics into your life from a planning perspective, be it in your personal life or into your business? So Larry, you've raised your hand again.
No, I don't think so.
But yeah, Larry's hand is up again. So go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead, Larry.
So the
Larry, can you talk a little louder?
Sure. Sure, I can. I can
Okay.
increase my a little bit.
That's good, Larry. Thanks.
The aspects that most people don't realize about energy, for instance, is that not some of the energy comes from the sun. All of the energy that we are using comes from the sun. Everything that we do about energy comes from the sun. And the myth of linear progress and choosing the right power options to fill in between now and when energy is renewable to an extent that we can use it, renewable energy, to power our entire society. Without changing our actual lifestyles, will not happen. And people just don't even think about population growth and how important it is that we have so many people on Earth these days, and how it's an unmentionable to even think about talking about reducing population some way or other. And that's the crux of the matter. The Petri dish is losing its resources. The Earth is our Petri dish, and when a Petri dish ends its material of growth media, the organisms die. And that's what we're doing. We're polluting our world. We're using things too fast, and we're privileged in the United States to have all of that red around that donut, sadly. And very few of us are willing to give that up. And that's problematic.
Yes. Larry, thanks for your
So-
comment. Appreciate it. We have another hand up. It's Kara.
Hi there, thank you. One of the things one of the opportunities I feel really strongly about is our ability as consumers to elect what products we buy and what we accept from the companies that provide goods and services. I don't know if any of you recently watched the movie Look Up, where they're kind of running around trying to get people to pay attention and do something. And I think that, instead of waiting around for somebody else to do something, we can really change our behavior, and that will have a knock-on effect on how businesses and governments serve us as consumers.
Great, Kara. Thank you for that. Yeah, Caroline, you have a comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to kind of build on what Kara just said. I think maybe we've all long, considered like what the impacts on the environment are of some of our lifestyles and our purchases, but maybe not as much about the impact on other human beings. And more and more, there are companies coming into existence that put that at the center of what they're about. And they will have you can see like B corporations or companies that are fair trade in all kinds of, not just food anymore, but in clothing, and you got Blue Sign for clothing. So they're really becoming more tools now. I find that very encouraging. I remember at one point I was like, I want to find ethical underwear, and where like I know that somebody's not just being exploited to like sew this underwear so I can get it for $8 a pair or whatever. And it was my son's partner was like, well, I know of an ethical underwear company, and she told me about it. So that I find encouraging. It's like, it's more and more of these small actions, and just our consciousness and sharing with each other. I think it does make a difference. And Patty was asking about, and a little bit to what Jude said about education and about, taking action. And we'll be sending out, I know Eric is going to say this at the end, but we'll be sending out some resources, Ellie will, in a follow-up email for people who registered for this event. But there's a thing called Donut Economics Action Lab. And everything in there is, licensed through the Creative Commons. So it means it's freely available. And there are lesson plans and teaching tools and, all kinds of tools in there that are just available. So we'll send the link out to that if anybody's inspired.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. Before we go to you, Sarah, I just wanted to mention that Christine wrote in here that it's needing to shift our attention or our attitude from competition and scarcity to one of cooperation and abundance. That's what she noticed about the donut economics approach. And thank you, Christine, for that comment. Sarah, how about yourself? Over to you. You can unmute yourself and share with the group. Thank you.
Just a brief comment that the only that this is new to me, but the only other time I attended a regenerative economy discussion was in the area of retirement and retirement planning and the investment of public funds and all the retirement funds, that there are efforts being made in certain sectors of retirement and financial planning that would emphasize the Thrive model over the unending growth model. So I don't have the name of those specific groups, but I would certainly be able to look into it. But I think that's also another hugely impactful public form of investment beyond all the personal choices that we're making for purchasing power. So I just wanted to mention that.
Great. Sarah, thanks for that. That was great. And maybe we'll find out some information, or if you could share what information you do learn with Ellie or with us through the contacts of where you registered, and we will be able to put push that information out to people. So if there's anything you do have, please share that with us. Is there anyone else, one last person before we close out for the evening, that would like to make a comment on what was heartened for you from this evening? Anyone? Well, maybe what I'll do then is I'll hand it over to Eric. We're right coming down to our last few minutes. It's 8:29. We try to end these on time. So Eric, I'd like to hand it back over to you for you to close it out. And again, thank you everyone for your
Kirk, thank you.
Yes.
I'd just like to add on, Caroline already talked a little bit about it. I'll just add, we will be sending out a resource list in about a week with books and more YouTubes and some articles. I'll put a plug in for one of my favorite economists, Gar Alperowitz, who's also always praises donut economics when he talks. And he's written some wonderful books. If anyone has taken advantage of the media, it is Kate. So if you go on YouTube, you will see 40 to 50 YouTubes, TED Talks here, TED Talks there, and they're all terrific. I want to point out, though, that in the program we saw tonight, there was a little 2.5-minute video about the creation of neoliberalism. Kate did about 10 of those, and I'll try to get those onto the resource list to know what YouTube had all 10 little films, because they go very quickly, but they're terrific. So of course, to close out, I will bring up the donation again. Caroline said in the chat that it's not just paper clips, but sometimes we have to rent a film or a short, and there's other costs that go with the screening. And again, I will emphasize, no one on our team gets paid. That's obvious. So I guess that will be it for the evening and also for the series this year. And we will try to be back next year, and we hope you will join us again. So good night, everybody. Have a good evening.